So we're now shifting to a unit on ecology, and our first chapter in ecology is going to deal with the ecology of individuals and populations. Here you can see many individuals of the same species of seabird, and these might be, I think, brown-footed boobies is what they're commonly called. But you can see right here with intense competition for nesting space on this island, as all seabirds need to come back to land to nest. With all that competition there, they seem to space out on this island more uniformly, evenly spaced. And so we kind of see this distribution of individuals in the population when resources are limited. And in this case, living space on that island is limited, so you get this uniform distribution. That concept of distribution of individuals in the population will come up in, I think, section 2 of this chapter. For now, we're going to look a little more closely at individuals. And so that's the topic for this chapter and this section here. So section 1 looks at the environmental challenges of individuals in the population. And so your first learning outcome is to list some challenges that organisms face in their environment. And then second objective is to describe ways in which individuals respond to their environmental changes. And then third objective is to explain how species adapt to environmental conditions. So let's go ahead and define what ecology is first. Ecos means, or eco, and ecos is Greek origin and means home. So literally studying, translated study of home. In this case, we're studying organisms and how they relate to one another and to their environment. So you're studying how organisms relate to their living things and not living things, both biotic, what they call biotic, and abiotic, non-living, like water. So there's key elements here in the environment that are going to determine the types of organisms that live in a region. And in fact, one of the fundamental questions in ecology as we study the home or the environment, the ecosystems where these organisms are living is, where are they and how many are they? And these are typically, we would say, the distribution, that's where, distribution, and abundance. In ecology, these are the fundamental questions that an ecologist asks in order to analyze anything else regarding that system. You have to have some measure of where they are and how many they are, and then start looking at explanations for that. And so some of the factors that can explain where and how many are temperature. Is it a hot climate? Is it a cold climate? How much water is available? Is it a desert? Is it a rainforest? How much sunlight and how much soil you have are all major factors for that. So this homeostasis, one of the last topics we talked about in our prior unit, and homeostasis is basically maintaining a steady state of environment within the living organism. That balance has to be maintained. It's dynamic because things are always changing. A good example would be your body temperature. You have to maintain homeostasis for that. And there's many other factors that need to be maintained within limits. Now, it's not going to be the same. These factors change, but we want to keep them within limits. So what are some strategies then for this sort of balance or homeostasis? One strategy is to regulate. Okay? And both ectotherms and endotherms can regulate when it comes to body temperature. They can regulate their body temperature, but the way they go about doing it is different because in endotherm, the energy is derived from within. That's why it's endotherm. And for ectotherm, it is from the outside. But they do regulate. They try to maintain a body temperature that may be quite different than the external temperature outside of the body. So here these regulators are going to actively use physiology, their structure, morphology, and even behavior. Like when a lizard, which is an ectotherm, goes out into the sun to warm up. An example here comes from a single-celled organism called a paramecium, which we learned about when we studied the kingdom Protista. They're osmoregulators. They regulate how much water is going into them because they have these they're in a freshwater environment, so their osmotic relationship is different with the environment. So because the environment is fresh water, there's a higher concentration of water outside than inside, so water tends to come in. So these paramecia are going to use organelles called contractile vacuoles to keep pumping that water out so that they maintain that water balance. Otherwise, they could run the risk of getting too much water into their cells, which can disrupt their metabolism and, worst case scenario, cause them to burst open. And then we have a strategy of just conforming. Just end up taking on the same concentration inside and outside if you live in the water. Stay the same temperature as the outside is to the inside. You don't even behaviorally try to regulate it, so you don't even go out into the sun, for example. A good example is sharks that live in salt water, not like the paramecium. The paramecium lives in fresh water, but a shark or other organisms that live in marine environments, there's a lot of salt dissolved in the water, and so in many cases that could cause the organism to lose water by osmosis, the opposite of what happens to the paramecium. And so the sharks are going to be osmoconformers because they're going to store compound called urea, which we have in our bodies. So this is how we transport the nitrogenous waste product that gets filtered in our kidneys. Well, they'll concentrate a lot of it within their tissue fluids so that there's they're isoosmotic with the environment there. So they're not gaining or losing any water. There's a balance between the amount of water coming in and out of their tissues with the ocean. So that would be a conformer and a way in which sharks handle that process. Here, you see a beetle in the image here helping to maintain its water balance. It lives in a desert, and it has a behavior that gives it its common name called the fog basking beetle, and then there's its scientific name. But they'll stand up on the top of a dunes in the early morning when there's moisture in the air, and the abdomen ends up having water condense on it, and then the water runs down their back, and then they drink the water from there. And so this case is a behavioral adaptation that allows them to get much needed water in a very dry environment. So responses to these environmental factors can be both short-term and long-term. And sometimes short-term, we refer to these as proximate responses. Long-term would be ultimate. And the long-term usually has to do with the way the environment places selective pressure on individuals, where those individuals that are not well adapted to the environment within a population may either die or not be able to reproduce as well as others. So that results in changes in future generations. So long-term is associated with natural selection. And this can provide an entire population with a better to be better adapted to the environment. So this is ultimate and results in changes over generations in time. That's ultimate or long-term. Proximate can take place over a few minutes in an individual's lifetime, and has to do with a variety of ways to cope with things. For example, pumping excess water out of yourself if you're a single-celled paramecium, or sweating if you heat it up too much. So now physiological responses to changes, and again, trying to maintain your homeostasis, right? So if you sweat too much, we talked about homeostasis for body temperature, and so we might sweat. And sweating helps take heat away or dissipate heat because it requires a lot of energy to cause water to go from liquid to a vapor. It's called heat evaporization. So that takes your excess heat away. It cools you down. Now, let's say you live high up in a mountain where the air is thinner. Organisms tend to live higher up where there's thinner air and less oxygen that you're able to get into your body. They're going to adapt by making more red blood cells, erythrocytes. So this is a name of a cell you have to know for your lab on tissues. And so their bone marrow ends up making more red blood cells. They have a higher blood cell count. And so they can transport more oxygen where oxygen is limited. So let's say you went up high up in a mountain and you lived there for a week or two. You're going to struggle and feel fatigue. And then over time, your body starts to do this short-term physiological response of building up your blood cells so that you can better handle that. Some arthropods in really cold environments actually make a natural antifreeze to keep their tissues from freezing. Here you can see an arthropod called a snow flea. It is a hexapod, which is in the same group as subphylum as insects. But it's actually frozen in water, but its tissues in there. The whole body is within a piece of ice. But their tissues are protected from being damaged by overfreezing because they have an adaptation of being able to make antifreeze molecules like glycerol, which is an alcohol, other alcohols, and some proteins that overall prevent the water from freezing within their tissues. And then morphological. So these are physiological, so within the way your metabolism works and so on. Morphological would be something like structurally. For example, endotherms that experience very cold winters. They're going to develop thicker fur during the cold times, and that thicker fur serves to trap a pocket of air, which provides this insulation. So here, that's going to help reduce the amount of energy that those animals need to help maintain their core temperature. If they get cold, they're going to have to shiver, and that takes a lot of energy. But if you have good insulation, then you use less energy trying to maintain your body temperature. So here, they're actually looking at a wolf and a polar bear, and they're plotting the data here. And the wolf is in the orange shading area, and the polar bear is in the blue. And then the dots for the orange dots are for summer, and the blue dots are for winter. So we see both the wolf here and then the polar bear here, and this would be during the orange dots are during summer, and then the blue dots are during winter. And you can see here that the fur thickness actually increases in winter, so they have thicker fur here. And then this scale here is just how much, a quantitative value for how much insulation that provides. So you can see that in winter, that thicker fur actually conserves more heat energy because you're getting higher values on this scale. And then behavioral responses, which had already been mentioned here. There's a lizard there in the first image here, and the lizards are ectotherms, so their body temperature derived from the outside. And they're comparing the same lizard from the genus Anolis. They're called anoles in general, and so this one's the Puerto Rican crested anole, and it's here in a tree. And if you live in a dense forest with a lot of tree, a lot of shade, it's going to be hard for you to find sun to warm up. So actually they compared the same species in a very shaded forest and one in a more open habitat where there's less trees, less shade. And you can see that the one that's in shade, like this lizard here, is basically its body temperature. So they were measuring the body temperature of the lizard, and they compared it to the air temperature. So the bottom axis is air temperature, and the y-axis is the body temperature. And you can see that basically the lizard that doesn't have access to the shade, its body temperature pretty much is directly related to the air temperature outside. Is pretty much the same. The line is the best fit line for those data points for the different lizards at different temperatures. So we come here at 26, you're roughly about 26 degrees there. However, that same lizard, or roughly around there, that same lizard here at the 26 degrees is going to be able to have a higher body temperature because they can go out into the sun and warm themselves up. So these behavioral adaptations sometimes have limits based on what kind of habitat they live in. And then here we have this amphibian is actually found in our area. It's called Staphyopus couchi, or Couch's spadefoot toad. It is in the class Amphibia and the order Anura, which is the frogs and the toads here. And these guys here, when they live in drier areas, and when their pond dries up, they bury themselves in the mud and form this kind of sort of a cocoon, and that helps them survive when conditions are intolerable otherwise. And then the ultimate factors like natural selection here. And here we have two closely related members of the mammals. So this class is mammals, and the order is Lagomorpha. This is an order of mammals. We belong to the primates order. We're still mammals, right? These guys are both in the genus Lepus, so they're cousins, cousin species. So they're Lepus species. So this one's Lepus arcticus, and this one is a species we have here. It's commonly called the black-tailed jackrabbit, and it's Lepus californicus. And you can see the difference here in the ears. Okay. Those ears are like radiators for heat. So this jackrabbit here lives in very hot climates, so those ears help to dissipate heat. Whereas this Arctic rabbit, those ears are smaller to help reduce the amount of heat loss, and then it's going to have a thicker coat of fur. So natural selection has worked to shape these ears to better have them adapted for the environment. And this actually follows Allen's rule and says that mammals that are not warm-blooded, but endotherms, that live in colder climates are basically going to have shorter ears and limbs. With smaller limbs, the limbs and the ears have a lot of surface area to lose heat. So if you live in a cooler environment, you're going to tend to have stubbier limbs and ears. And your body's probably also going to be more massive too, so that you have more volume and you can retain more heat that way. And then desert frogs. So remember we were talking about the word toad is not mean a monophyletic group. These desert frogs are going to have drier skin. We might actually call them toads. More generally, it doesn't mean that they share a kinship with other toads that live in an other than a desert region. And so these desert frogs are going to have a thicker skin, more keratin, a drier, bumpier skin. So that's natural selection acting on them to have thicker skin over many generations. So here's a big idea for section 2 in what populations are. Population, it's a group of a single species living in one place at a given time. So your learning outcomes for this section are to distinguish between a population and a metapopulation. But we have to first define that population and consider it, and then understand what causes a species' geographic range to change through time. That's your second one. So first, let's look at the definition for population. Population, as the title for this section suggests, is a group of individuals living in a place and at a given time. So a population today might be different than the way the population was a year ago, right? So the time is an important consideration. There's 3 characteristics for when we consider the ecology of a population as a system. And one is its range, the area where you find that population. The next one is the pattern of spacing, the distribution, something I mentioned right before starting section 1 when we were looking at those seabirds nesting on the island. And then the second one is how many. Population size, and we'll symbolize size with an N. So N would be equal to size of population. Kind of like the way we use N for sample size here, capital N would be used for for the size of the population, and population sizes change with time. So looking at a population's geographic distribution is what its range is called. So the population's range is distribution. Now we got to be careful because sometimes we could be referring to a population as not the entire species itself. The entire species may have a broader geographic distribution or a range, and then you may be considering smaller populations. So you got to be careful on how exactly the range is defined. So we don't want to confuse that. So I have a little note here about that confusion. And I bring an example here of a bird called the seaside sparrow, which is scientific name is Ammodramus maritima. And you can see why it gets its name. This is the picture of that sparrow there on the bottom right. But looking at the map here, you can see it lives along the coast, even in South Texas, and then ranges all along the south here and then up the east coast here. And the species distribution can be different than populations. In fact, within limits of the certain portions of this range, there are enough differences to identify subspecies. Like the one found here in the South Texas coast. It's called the subspecies Senetai. So it's Ammodramus maritima, and then they give a third name. It's a trinomial to designate that subspecies, and in this case, it's Senetai. And so here we might just be referring to this population as opposed to the one over here on the eastern side of Florida over there. So I got to be careful with what are we referring to, the entire species range or the population range. Some populations have very limited geographic range, and in fact, the entire species of the devil's hole pupfish, the Cyprinodon diabolus, is just found in one spring, a single spring in Nevada. So the entire population is also the entire species range. Polar bears. Those, their common name, polar bears, for a reason. They're found in colder areas. You're not going to find them in warmer tropical areas. So several factors are going to determine whether or not a population can be supported at a location. And so we get to some of those same factors you mentioned at the very beginning of this chapter here. They're climate factors like temperature, rainfall, food, and then other things like competitors, things competing for the same resources, predators, those things that might eat you, parasites. All of these things can determine what your distribution is, what your geographic range is. So ranges can, overall for species, can undergo expansions and contractions, and they can spread, and then they can become reduced through time. And they may do this for two reasons. The first reason why a population's range may expand or decrease is the environment changes. So they give an example here with mountain species of trees, and then where these trees go, other species go. Certain types of animals live in that certain kind of habitat, right? So here, the bottom picture shows a mountain, and it shows the tree line on that mountain. If you go lower, you don't see that tree line here. And this is the way those trees species were distributed along this mountain. So their distribution and not along the surface, but altitude-wise, so elevation here. And so here you have different kinds of forests, woodlands, you have mixed conifer trees, and you have spruce firs up here. And then you have alpine tundra. And tundra, you can have a latitudinal tundra where you go to northern latitudes, and it's basically treeless there. But during this time, 15,000 years ago, you had glaciers, you had glaciation. We were in a glacial period. That's something we talked about earlier, when you have periods of time when you have regional glaciation, not snowball Earth, but parts of the Earth are covered in ice because temperature's cooler. And if you do that, then these trees that are actually adapted for cooler environments can live lower on lower elevations out here. But now we're in an interglacial period. We're in a time when the overall global temperature is warmer, so the glaciers retreat or they melt away, and overall temperature is warmer. And so these trees here that are normally adapted to cooler environment have slowly but surely moved further up, because as you go higher up in elevation, the temperature is cooler up there. So these trees move because the environment has changed in that time. So that's an example of the environment causing a change in the distribution of these trees. A second reason is that how a population may expand or contract, and might be because, and in this case, expand their distribution, is because a population gets around a situation where the environment can no longer support them, an inhospitable situation here. And this was the case with a species of bird commonly called the cattle egret, because they like to follow cattle and other large hoofed animals out in prairies and grasslands, where as those hoofed animals are grazing, they're walking in the grass, and they're scaring up insects. So these birds like to follow around and pick up what they get. They also follow around tractors in agricultural areas as well. But this species is from Africa, and a group of them seems to have migrated to this location here in South America in the 1930s. And then over time, they just went ahead and expanded to areas that were capable of supporting new individuals as they're being born. So these populations expanded both in South America here, getting to this point here on the western slope of the Andes Mountains out here, by the 1970s. You can see over here by the 1970s, all this species is found all the way up here. Now, we do have our own types of egrets and herons. That's a group of birds there, but this one is a non-native, and we find it commonly here now because of a range expansion. And of course, this cattle egret can't live in the ocean, on ocean water. They're not built for floating on water or flying for long periods of time. But they may have gotten here across the Atlantic with a good strong tailwind. They are capable of flying, and with the right amount of push, a group of them could have landed there and spread. Then there's a human effect. So human activity can cause range expansions or losses. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that's occurring too, where we go in there and we start cutting down rainforests or changing the environment in some way. So the humans can cause contractions as well, but they give example here of range expansions. That's the case with the coyote, which the scientific name is Canis latrans, and it is in the vertebrate class Mammalia, but in the order Carnivora. We did some of that taxonomy in the prior unit. And here, basically, humans altered the habitat here and killed off a lot of top predators. And one big competitor for the coyote was the wolf. The wolf used to have a real broad range all around the world in the northern hemisphere. But humans went and killed them off, and then that reduced competition for coyotes. And along with other changes in the landscape, coyotes have now spread and become very abundant. And in fact, coyotes are predators, but they're smaller than what the large predators used to be. So they're called mesopredators, which means mid-level predators. And so this seems to be a trend, and is actually written about in some of these scientific papers here about the rise of the mesopredators due to the loss of top predators. And then other ones here, this one's called the European starling. You might guess its origin is not from here, but we find it here. And it's Sturnus vulgaris, very pretty breeding plumage that you see here. It's the class Aves, and it's a perching bird in the Passeriformes. But this bird was introduced here on purpose. People brought this bird over here, I believe it was to the New York City area, because they wanted to try to recreate some Shakespearean play that mentioned several birds. They brought them there, and then this bird really spread everywhere. And the thing about them is they do become invasive because they outcompete native birds for nesting sites. We have a lot of birds that nest in cavities made by woodpeckers, so we have secondary cavity nesters that go in there, and these birds will kick them out or outcompete them for those nesting sites. So that causes harm to the ecosystem. And then when we look at dispersal mechanisms, how might a species, other than some of the ways we've talked about, species can disperse just by the way by their adaptation, get dispersed, land in a new area, and then reproduce there, and that habitat happens to be real supportive or turn to have the right conditions for individuals to build a population there. So the dispersal mechanisms can include humans. Humans have been responsible for spreading species globally, and usually that's not with good results. Currently here in just around my house, I'm seeing a species of anoles, little anolis lizards, that's not native to here. It's called the brown anole, and it's seeming to outcompete the green anole, which was more native to this area, and so it's looking to push out that other one overall. But that's an example of an expansion. Other cool ones are like the brown widow, like the black widow, but the brown widow, that one has dispersed and now has some populations here. Lizards, speaking of lizards can, and other animals that might not normally be found on an island, could get there and disperse by accidental means. For example, getting caught on some driftwood or some drift vegetation, and then just float over there, and then maybe it's a gravid female who has fertilized eggs, and then boom, we lay, and then next we know we got a population going there. And then seeds have ways of dispersing. All of these, by the way, can be spread by humans as well, but some have just can do it by natural means. So like fruits from angiosperms. Some fruits are built to be dispersed by wind, like these types of fruits, and then some stick to an animal's fur or feathers, like these burrs here. And then some are built to be eaten, like these here. These berries can be eaten, and then the seeds get taken elsewhere when they're released with the feces of the animal. And then individuals are going to exhibit spacing patterns. And I mentioned earlier with the seabirds, they look much like these penguins here that are in an area competing for nesting space. So you would have what's called a uniform. It's called a uniform distribution or spacing. So if I say what kind of distribution spacing distribution is a uniform distribution. And here this has to do with behavioral interactions at times. And here we see this in animals when there's intense competition. You might also see it in the desert when there's not a lot of water availability, and you see it with plants. In this case, plants may not necessarily be interacting behavior-wise with each other, but there's limited water and good soil for them to grow in, so the seeds will tend to only germinate in certain areas, and then you get this even distribution there. The more common one is to see a clumped distribution, in which you'll see clumping like these elephants here. And the reason for that is that resources like water and food tend to be clumped in nature as well, in space. And so the other organisms will also start to clump in those areas. The least common kind of distribution is just total random spacing. And here, there's not a lot of strong interaction with one another. And the resources necessary for individuals to survive within that population are not necessarily clumped. So this is not a very common distribution here, but you can see some random distribution of these dandelion flowers here. And it might be that their seeds just land in places at random, and no matter where they landed, it was a suitable place for those plants to grow. And then we come to the concept of metapopulation, which is talking about these subpopulations that are not connected continuously. So here, you're going to have, for metapopulations, they're going to be located in populations where the suitable conditions are patchy themselves. And this could be vegetation, or it could be an animal itself that you would have this metapopulation. So here, the key here is that the appropriate habitat is patchy as well. So you might have suitable habitat here, and then miles away you have another suitable patch area somewhere else, and then a larger area over here. And then you would find either plants or animals located only in those areas there. That would be you would have a metapopulation here, here, and here. You know, when you're dealing with metapopulations, there's certain considerations to think about here. And so we start looking at what's called occupancy of the individuals within there. And so there's going to be interactions that occur within there that are going to create dispersals or spreading. So let's say you have a large patchy area right here, and you have many individuals, and they're all competing for resources. And as we reproduce, the number of individuals increase here, and so the area can't support everybody. So you have a choice: you either die because you can't find your resources, or you disperse to another habitat that might not be as suitable, but you're going to be able to make a living there. So you spread out that way, right? So there's interaction that goes on within here. Here you might not have so many individuals that they're going to actually send individuals back to this place over here, right? So it turns out that that's would be the case. And if you have a patchy area that's very, very small, and some individuals dispersed here, and then it's a while before others make it over there, these individuals here may reproduce, or they just may die out. So you might have this little local extinction from that small little metapopulation that's there. So that's going to be the case when you have real small patches. Those little patches can become locally extinct overall. But the overall effect here is that your species and your occurs over a broader range due to these metapopulations here. So when we were talking about these larger areas that have more individuals within these metapopulations, so the larger metapopulation and the smaller one. The larger one might be referred to as a source population, and the smaller one, which tends to receive more from the larger one, would be called a sink area. So the areas that have a larger habitat with suitable habitat are going to be sustained for much longer And then they tend to provide individuals to those smaller areas, which are a sink for them. So these are the smaller areas have smaller populations that would die out if not for the larger population overall. So we would refer to those areas that may die out if it wasn't for the larger population as sinks. But what is the overall effect here? Is that this continuing movement of individuals from a source to those sinks actually makes the overall range of this population and overall numbers larger. And so overall that helps sustain and maintain the entire species over these metapopulations. That's kind of the idea here. And so here's an example here and some small islands. So these are the small islands. They're located right here just off of the area of Finland. So here's Finland here, here's Sweden and Norway here. And so we're talking about these small islands here called the Åland Islands here. And this is the species of butterfly called the Glanville fritillary butterfly, and there's its scientific name here. And you can see here that it's not evenly distributed on these islands. Those little dots represent patches of populations or areas of suitable habitat that are not currently occupied. So overall, we may see a population exist, and then you don't see them there anymore, and you see them in another place. So you have several metapopulations and areas where a metapopulation could exist. So you're going to have areas where they become locally extinct, and then they appear somewhere else. And so overall, you have the entire you call the entire population there is being sustained due to these metapopulations overall. But what's been happening over here with these metapopulations for the species, it's been seen that over a long period of time that overall the entire population on these islands is decreasing. So we're seeming to have more extinctions than expansions within these metapopulations. And so that's concern for those conservation biologists. So those are the things that are mentioned there. And the big idea here is the metapopulation. So this section is going to look at the idea of demography, which looks at studying how populations will change through time. And so it's very quantitative, and the word dynamics in this title for the section shows that change, right? So if it was static, no change. So here we're looking at what are factors that influence populations to either grow or decrease in size. And so you need to be able to define demography for this section, and then describe the factors that influence species demography, how it changes, the population does, and then explain the significance of survivorship curves. So here's your term demography. It is the quantitative study of populations, and it looks at how size of population changes through time. Remember, N is for population size. So for demography, what it can do ultimately is tell you if your population is increasing or decreasing or remaining constant. Now, the population can be broken down into the rates at which changes are occurring, and some of those rates of change are positive, like when births occur. Individuals born in a population are going to increase, and then deaths, which would be taken away. Now, a real demography study for a local population would have to also consider migration. So if you're defining the demography of a local population, you got to consider movements in and out. So immigration and then emigration with an E. And immigration would be adding, just like births, and emigration, leaving, would be subtracting. But if we're considering an entire species, so the entire population, not just a local population, then you can't leave the planet, right? So there's no migration in that sense. But just keep in mind that we would have to also consider migration, and there's positive and negative migration. So let's just keep it simple and look at birth and death rates. First of all, if you do have separate sexes, then it's all important to know about the sex ratio. because it really is separate male and female. It's the females that are actually producing the offspring. The males are important because we need the sperm to fertilize the egg for sexual reproduction. But the females are the ones really who are making the offspring. And so the ratio of males to females is important. If there is a low ratio of females or a low number of females, then that can influence how many are born. Less would be born. If you have more females than in that ratio of male to female, then you can have a potential for higher birth rates. So the idea of sex ratios is important. Another important factor is generation times. And the generation time is the average interval, which is time, a time interval that it takes from birth to having the first offspring. And so it depends on the species. If you are short generation time, it might be a few months, and then like an insect or something, and you're already having the next generation. Or it could be much longer generation time, like in the case of a human or a whale or so on. So that can have an influence, because if you have a short generation time, then there's potential for that population to grow quickly, like insects, for example. Okay. Generally speaking, though, if we wanted to look at the size of organisms, there's an actual relationship between the size of the organism and its generation time. That's his last point here. And this graph shows that. They're using a log scale here for body size, so it's not linear. It changes at every unit on an order of 10 change, starting in the microscopic world and going all the way to 100 meters here. So here we jump from going from 10 meters to 100 meters, so that's a change. This is also probably a log scale here for generation time, starting at 1 hour, and then over here 100 years. This is 10 years, this is 1 year, and so on. And you can see that there's roughly a positive relationship between the size of the organism and how long it takes to have your first offspring here. Really giant trees like a sequoia, redwood tree, those are going to have generation times on the order of 100 years. It's going to take 100 years from seedling before they start making their first cones. These are pine trees. For humans, a bit less here. We're between 1 and 2 meters tall, around there, maybe a little bit taller than that if you're in the NBA. And then the generation time there, well, we know the generation. Again, this is a log scale, so the change from here to here is not going linear, okay? But right there on the log scale, that would be what, 16, 18, 20 years old before first offspring are born. Hopefully later, right? Give a chance to get set in a career, education, that kind of stuff. But the generation time, the point is that the size of the size of the average size of that species is related to the generation time. Is the point here. If you go down here just real quick to these microscopic organisms like bacteria and protists here, they have a generation time of hours and days, so they can, right, they're populate, they can have lots of offspring, and there's potential to have a lot of them born, new offspring. Another important tool in the study of demography of a population is to look at age structure and look at these age pyramids that we see here. And here we have an age pyramid for a species called Homo sapiens. You might know that one. They're mammals and they're primates, and it's us here. But you can do an age structure for any species. And for humans, which have separate male and female, we have an age structure here. And it's useful when we're doing this structure. We're structuring it by age cohort. So we're going to look at age groups. And then you want to look at how many do you have within that age group. And then since this is demography, we're interested in looking at how does this age structure influence how your population changes. So within this age structure, we want to look at a rate called fecundity, which is the number of offspring born, or the rate at which offspring are born per female. Right, so it might be 1 per female, or 2 per female, or 3 per female. It depends on where you're at. If these are humans, fecundity rates vary in different countries around the world, and it's related to economics and other social factors within that area of the globe here. And then also important is mortality rates. If you're not alive, you can't reproduce. So mortality rates are also important in this age pyramid in looking at trying to understand whether or not your population is growing, right? So what we want to do here is we look at, and how do you interpret it? That's going to be right here. So we'll just go over here, and we notice that each of these pyramids are for different situations. So here you have you're going to separate between male and female. The bars going out to the left are going to be the number of males, to the right females. Same thing on each of these pyramids, but you notice they look very different. And we have some major cohorts. So each bar itself probably represents 4 to 5 years of age, probably 5 years maybe, or something like that. And if we're going from 0 to 14 years here, these are juveniles. These are pre-reproductives. They're typically not reproducing at any point there. So here, you're just there, but you're growing, you're aging. You can see that there's a little drop on each side. That means that some of those individuals that were very young didn't make it to the next age group, right? That it could mean that. It may not, because right now you may be just looking at the structure as a snapshot. So you're looking at the entire population at one time. So it doesn't necessarily mean we have a drop in the number of individuals from one year to the other. You're just looking and saying, look, I've got this many from 0 to 5. I got this many from 6 to 10 years old, and so on. And then you have over here those that are individuals that are in their later years. What you do see, though, is that as you're going to see less and less towards the top in this case here. But what's important here is that at the bottom here of the pyramid, you have individuals that are not reproducing yet, but they're fixing to get into their reproductive years, which are in green here. Okay, ages here 15 to 44. After about, once you get into the 40s, on average, females are going through menopause in the human population, and they're no longer releasing eggs, so they cannot become pregnant anymore. And so in the red, you're in your post-reproductive years. Okay. The point here is that, and they have example countries here in each one that show this kind of an age structure. If you have an age structure with a real white base, you have a lot of juveniles that are fixing to get into their reproductive years, and that means this population has great potential to grow rapidly. So age structure pyramid for humans in which the bottom base is large, that means that population is growing. You just know it, okay? The opposite is seen over here, and there's some example countries here like Germany, which is showing negative growth. That means overall the entire population of something like Germany is actually decreasing over the years. And you can tell that because the base with those juveniles is smaller than the rest of the pyramid, okay? And so there's not very many juveniles getting into their reproductive years. And then you have one that looks like it's more flat between the pre-reproductives and the reproductive years here. And here, basically, there's zero growth. Your population would be stable. So make sure you know how to interpret these age pyramids. And I actually included another graph here to show that sometimes, and they didn't make age pyramids out of this, but they could have, just like this. But they have a bar graph showing for a whale shark, which is ectotherm. And there, the age at which they first mature is not necessarily related to their age. This is true for a lot of ectotherms. Instead, what matters is what size they get to. So how fast they can get to that size is more important because their age at which they're first reproducing is more related to size. And so instead of having an age structure, you would have a size structure. So here it's a variation on age pyramid. They have both male and female data there. And here instead of age, they have size. And then the bars are just telling you the number of individuals for each one. Don't labor on trying to learn how to interpret this one, but this actually has demographic data related to size rather than age there. And you could make predictions about whether or not that population is stable or growing or decreasing based on the size structure. Now, this next one here is a pretty good exercise in interpreting numbers. It's a life table, and life tables can be used to determine if your population is growing, remaining stable, or decreasing. And they use a species of grass that doesn't live much more than 2 years. It's called an annual bluegrass because it takes, on the average, about a year, roughly, to complete its entire life cycle to go from plant to seed. Now, it's not exactly a year, so they just call them an annual, and then the next generation comes the next year. In fact, some individuals here will live 2 years and continue to produce seeds during that time. So it's not extremely accurate to say an annual grass. But anyhow, when we look at these life tables, they're also useful to for other things than just determining if your population is growing or not. They can be useful for things like life insurance companies for humans. If you did a life table, they can figure out, this table gives you information on, for a certain age group, it'll tell you what your chances are of surviving, and the opposite of that is of dying. One is survivorship rate, and the other one is mortality rate, and they're opposites of each other, right? So if there's an 85% chance of survival at a certain age, that means there's a 15% chance of death at that age group, right? So insurance companies really like to know that, because if your chances of dying are pretty high, they're going to charge you a lot of money for your life insurance policy, right? So there's various uses for this. Now, the trick here is to start on this side here and note that this is supposed to be ages, and these are intervals. So they're not the same as the age here. It says that each interval is a 3-month interval. So here's time 0 at the very beginning when we start our observations. Time interval 1, though, would be equivalent to 3 months, because each one of these is a 3 months worth of time. So by the time you get to the next one, 3 months have gone by, right? At interval 2, by the time you complete interval 2, 6 months of time have gone by. If we go all the way down to here, 8 intervals, each one being 3 months. 8 times 3, that's 24. So this would be 24 months all the way down here, 2 years. Okay. Now here they're going to be following a group of 843 seedlings, and they're going to follow them all the way through. And so they start with 843. So cohort then would be the total number of individuals. So here your entire cohort. And then you can have your sub-cohorts. You can have your age groups, right? So the entire cohort is 843. So anytime I say cohort, we're referring back to the 843 individual seedlings. 843 individuals, okay? Now here, this grass plant has flowers that has both anthers, where pollen is produced, and the ovary where the ovule is produced. Now, we went over that biology earlier, so that means they have both male and female on the same individual, so there is no separate male and females. Okay? Also keep that in mind here. So if we start at our first interval here, we're going to have 843 individuals to start at the beginning of that individual. By the time we get to the next interval, so by the time we get to, say, right here at this mark right here before we go to the next one, 3 months have gone by. We started at time 0 at the start of this interval. Now 3 months have gone by. At the beginning of that next interval, we're at 3 months, and then we start going into the 4th month, 5th month, and so on. By the time we start this interval, there's only 722 to start that interval. That means some have died between time 0, when we first started with all the ones that were alive, and the 3 months that go by. At the end of 3 months, only 722 are alive before we start this first time interval. Okay. Now we start this first time interval, 722 are alive, and then during the next 3 months, some are going to die. How many survive to the next time interval here? 527, and then we continue until we get to none surviving at 24 months. Okay. So what this means is that we're going to have a certain number that are surviving. That's survivorship. And we're going to have a certain amount dying. That's mortality. So these are mortality rates. And they're expressed as ratios. In other words, you're going to divide the number, for survivorship, you're going to divide the number that are surviving, okay, by the cohort size. Okay, so that would be your survivorship in this column here. So if we, at the very start, we're starting at the beginning for this time interval here, 0, 843, 100% of them are alive, or a ratio of 1. 843 divided by 843 is 1. Okay. When we get to the next interval, 722 are only alive out of the original cohort 843. That gives us a ratio in decimal form of 0.856, or about 85.6 survived to the next interval from the original group, right? So now, if we were to go to the second time interval 2, right when we're starting at 6 months have gone by, and now we start interval 2 where another 3 months are going to go by. Here at the start of this interval, after exactly 6 months, 527 are alive. So you ask yourself, what is the survivorship at this point? That's taking 527 and dividing by 843, and that's a ratio of 0.625. So about 62.5% of the individuals we originally started with have survived when we start time interval 2. Okay, that's how you explain that column there. Okay, so here on the fourth column, these are the deaths, right, that are going to occur during that time interval. We started with 843, and at the start, 100% we're starting with. When we get to the next interval, 722 are alive. Okay, 722. So how many died from here to here? A total of 121 died during that first time interval, right? Because this is how many are alive when we first start from the original. So we can continue with that. So in the next time interval, 195 die. That's the difference between these two. Okay, going from 722 to 527, how many died? 195 died. Okay, that's the absolute number of deaths. Mortality rate is the rate dying during that interval. Okay, so we actually have a rate. 121 died during our very first time interval, starting from time 0 to getting to the next one. So we would take 121 and divide it by 843, and that gives us a mortality rate of 0.144, which is 14.4%, right? And then so on down here. So here, if I took 211 died, right, of the 527 we started with, and what are your chances of dying when you start this interval? The chance is 40%. Okay, so 211 divided by 527 is that. So that's your mortality rate. Now, at every interval, the plants that are alive during that time are starting to make seeds. When they're little seedlings, they're not making flowers yet. So during the first 3 months, none of the 843 plants made any seeds. When we get to time interval 1, after the first 3 months, they're already starting to flower, but there's only 722. Those 722 that start that interval, some are going to be dying during those 3 months, but of the starting point of 722, 303 seeds were produced altogether of the ones that are alive. Not of all 843, because remember, 121 died before we started here. So of the 722, how many seeds were produced? 303. And if you think about it, that's not even 1 seed per plant. So there's less seeds being produced than the number of plants right now. So basically, a lot of them are still immature and haven't made flowers yet. Okay, some of them were a little faster to flower, and they've done it. Okay, so that's the idea here. When we get to the start of the second interval, or time interval 2, 527 start at that point. And of those 527, a total of 622 seeds were produced. So now we're talking about, on average, every plant is producing at least a seed, right? And that brings us to the next one here. That's fecundity. Fecundity is the average number of seeds produced per number of individuals that start out at that point, right? So if I were to take, at this point here, 0 seeds for the 843 that started, well, that's 0 fecundity, because 0 divided by 43 is nothing, right? But over here in the next one, 303 seeds were produced of the 722 that were alive, and we said that's less than 1 seed per individual, and that's what we get here. 0.42 is less than 1 seed per individual. It's only 0.42 seeds per individual. That's what fecundity is. And we took this all the way down here. There's not very many individuals alive. There's only 3 still alive here as we're approaching that last interval where there's none alive anymore. And of these 3 that started, how many seeds were produced? 10. Okay, so 10 divided by 3 gives us 3.33 seeds per number of individuals. Again, so that highlights what fecundity is. Okay, Now, the last column is actually going to give us our report, the number of seeds produced per member of the cohort altogether at that time interval. So it's considering just the number of seeds produced here for, and then figuring out how many seeds is that per number of individuals that we completely started with. Okay. So in order to get this column here, I would have to take that 622 seeds that were produced during this time interval, and we're not going to divide by the number of individuals that started that interval. We're going to divide it by the number of individuals that we started with to begin with. Okay, and when we do that, we get this value here, 0.74. 622 divided by 843 gives us 0.74 number of seeds for number of individuals of the cohort altogether. Okay, that's what this last column is. That's that final column is the number of seeds relative to the size of the original cohort. So that's number of seeds divided by per individual of the cohort. So the number of seeds that were produced at that interval, these right here, these values, divided by the number, which is 843 individuals. Okay. The final answer is going to give you a number of seeds per one individual. When you divide by 843 individuals, you're going to get seeds per individual there. Okay. So cohort really is the number of individuals altogether, which is 843 altogether. So this last column is like taking seeds that were produced during that interval, which is this column here, like 303, and then you divide by the number of individuals in the cohort, which was 843. Okay, that's how you get it. However, they don't tell you that in here in this formula. Right here, they say the way you can get it is multiplying fecundity times survivorship. So I'm thinking, oh great, that's not this formula here. How did they get that? So let's go back and look real quick. What is fecundity? Okay, fecundity was right here, and fecundity is the number of seeds produced per surviving individuals. So the units is still per individual, but not individual number of individuals in the cohort. It's individuals that survive that time interval, right? So let's say that seeds produced, that's number of this column, per surviving individuals. That's this column here. Okay, that's the number that we started with that survived at that interval to make those seeds. So let's go ahead and write that down. Fecundity is the seeds produced divided by not individuals of the cohort, but the individual survivors of that interval. So individuals, SURV for surviving. And then it says multiply that by survivorship. Survivorship is another column down a ways. That one's over here. So we think back, how do we calculate survivorship? Well, we got the number from this column, the first column here, which is the number of surviving, okay? And we divided that by the cohort size, the number of individuals in the cohort, right? So to get the survivorship, to get this number here, you're taking the number that have survived to start that interval and you're dividing by the 843, the number in the cohort. So again, individuals that survive to that interval, and we're dividing by the number of individuals in the cohort. And if I look at this formula here, the individuals that survive is the same number as this one, so those two cancel out, and that gives me seeds. When I multiply across, that gives me seeds over cohort. So you can see there's two ways to calculate this. The way we started with over here is more direct. The way over here, we have to have more numbers here, right? So it's pretty simple. You're going to get the same number either way. Okay, so essentially, to get this number, if I multiply 1.18, that number, which is fecundity, and I multiplied it from the same row, this number 0.625, I multiply those two numbers, I'm going to get 0.74. How else can I get it? you get that number. You get 0.74. How else can I get it? I can just get the number of seeds right here, which is the offspring, right? Seeds are like the babies, the embryos within there. You can get this right here, and if you divide it by 843, you get the same number. There are two ways to get it. And the answer is given in number of seeds per number of individuals. Seeds per individual. Okay, not seeds per 843. Seeds per individual is the answer, right? So all of these represent the number of seeds per individual at that time interval. And if we add them all up, all together, you're going to get a total number of seeds per individual over all the time intervals. And in this case, with these numbers here, we get an answer of 1.98. 1.98 seeds per individual for this cohort over all 8 months. Okay, that's the way you interpret it. Was there another way to get this? Well, if this is the total of doing this for every row, we can do that. We can get this same number if we just get the total number of seeds right here, 1,665, and divide it by the 843. And if you did that, you get the same number, because this is the total seeds over all of that time. So instead of doing it in steps, you can do it with the total here. Now, why do we run this table? Because sometimes we want to know the mortality rates at those different ages. These would represent different ages, right? That's also important information. But ultimately, here at the bottom, this tells us whether or not our population is growing or remaining stable or decreasing. Now, I want you to think about this here. I told you at the beginning that this grass has both male and female on the same plant. Okay? So the individual plant is all you would need, really, to produce offspring. So here, each plant, which has both male and female, is producing on average 2 seeds from that original cohort, 2 seeds per individual. What that means is if each seed, 1.9 is about 2, if each seed germinates, then that one individual that produced those 2 seeds, that one individual plant from the prior generation has now produced 2 new plants. That means your population is doubling. It's on the increase. Okay? That's what that number tells us. Now, if we were to do this analysis for humans, it's the female that has fecundity. It's the female that is the one that's having the offspring. So this table here, if we're trying to determine if the population is growing or not, this table would be important for just running it for females. But remember, there's males in the population also. Okay. So that number, if we were to get 1.98 or 2, the interpretation would be different. Here the population would be stable because only the female can produce offspring. Yes, the male has to be there to provide the sperm to fertilize the egg. But if each female is providing 2 offspring on average per female for that entire population, that's enough to replace both her and her partner. So you're barely going to be breaking even. So here your population is remaining stable. So how you interpret that number depends, right? Okay. On whether or not both male and female are on the same individual in the population, or if you have separate male and females. So that's pretty important to understand. So lastly, there's this survivorship curves, and they tell you what the probability of surviving is at any given age here. And there's some general trends, but to be honest with you, most species are going to have be somewhere in between the extremes here, between the blue and the red. Now down here on the bottom, this is interpreted as the percent of the maximum lifespan, and this allows us to compare species that live long time, like a human, they live up to 80 years, and a species like an oyster that's maximum 100% of its life might be 5 years. Okay. Whatever the case is, this number out here represents 100% of how long they live. And now we can plot a human that lives a long time and an oyster that doesn't live a very long time and put them at the same place here, their maximum lifespan, 100% of that time. So this is a relative scale here as a percent. So 50 right here would be half of the oyster's lifespan. If they lived at 5 years, then 50% would be 2.5 years, but 50% for the human would represent about 40 years. Okay. That's the way that works. Over here, this is your survivorship as a proportion, right? Value of 1 means 100% survive. And so when we're up here, that's 100% born, and then time goes. As time goes, individuals are going to be dying, so you're going to have your survivorship overall decrease, right? So what is the opposite of survivorship? The opposite of survivorship is mortality. Okay, so what these graphs show here is it shows the actual line itself shows how many are surviving, but the opposite of that is mortality. So if we were to look at a type 1, which is typical of, say, human, when humans are first born, yes, there's an infant mortality. Some do die, but the majority survive. They survive as we progress in age. They survive. There's so many survive. And then what changes? Once you get to a certain age, less of you are going to survive, so your survivorship changes, right? So now the survivorship is much lower, and that means mortality rate is higher at these higher ages. So the survivorship curve tells you that most survive early on, which means low mortality rate, and then once you get to the advanced ages, then your survivorship is low and your mortality rate increases. For the oyster, the opposite is true. When the oysters are first born in their little larvae swimming around looking to go find a place to go into metamorphosis and change to what a bivalve looks like, many of those larvae don't survive. So the survivorship is very low, and that means mortality rate is high. Okay? When mortality rate is very high, that's called a type 3. Type 3 mortality rate is high. So you're talking about mortality rates. And the opposite again is survivorship. That means survivorship is very low. For a human, mortality rate is very low at the start, that's why there's a high survivorship. That would be a type 1, and then type 2 would be more of a constant survivorship, which means constant mortality rate throughout the entire time. That would be a type 2. And they give an example of a hydra, which is, remember, related to the jellyfish, right? Now, I told you just a while ago that in reality, most species are going to be somewhere in between these two real extreme areas here, and that's true for this bluegrass we were just studying. If we went back and we plotted those survivorship numbers that we can get off the table, and then this axis again is their age, in months instead, we see that at first it starts to look like a type 1, like a human. Many survive. The survivorship is high with a low mortality rate, and then mortality rate increases a bit and then stays constant the whole time, and the line becomes straight here. So for our bluegrass, it's actually somewhere between a type 1 and a type 2 to start with, and then turns more like a type 1 and then has a constant mortality rate there. So here in this section, we're going to be looking at life history, which is a description of a life cycle of an organism, but it also includes the influences of how the environment shapes these characteristics of the life cycle. In other words, over long periods of time and over many generations, natural selection shapes these life cycles, these life histories. And some of that shaping has to do with the cost of reproduction. To reproduce as an organism, it costs you energy and it can cost you your life. And so if you can survive with your traits and your characteristics and produce offspring, then those offspring will inherit your traits. If you cannot, then it won't. So however the environment influences who survives, who reproduces. So the variation seen in a population will be shaped by some of the forces, and that's how natural history plays a role in there. So your learning outcomes here then are to describe the trade-offs in an organism's life history. And the trade-off would be a trade-off between having an offspring and not surviving, or surviving and not having any offspring. Neither one is good, because at some point the organism is gonna die anyway. So you have to figure out when is the best time to reproduce and how much to reproduce, so that you can at least leave a certain number of offspring. So there's the interplay between reproduction and what it costs you as an individual to reproduce. Now, number 2, to compare the costs and benefits of allocating resources for reproduction. It costs you energy to reproduce, and it could cost, in some cases, the ultimate price of not surviving at all. So, natural selection then is going to favor. Natural selection is the environment on individuals in a population, and natural selection will shape the way that population looks overall. For example, the age at which you first reproduce. There's an average age within a population, and natural selection has shaped that over many generations, right? There's going to be 2 factors that are going to be affected here, right? So, how many offspring? So that's what we're talking about. How many offspring are you going to leave? So that's one of them. Is, how long do you live as an individual? If you live a long time, that's a factor. Another one is, depending on how long you live, how many young do you produce each year? And so maybe you don't live very long, but you leave a lot of offspring when you do reproduce. Or maybe you live a long time and you reproduce a little bit over that long period of time. Every year you produce some. So there's a trade-off there. So again, our organisms are going to provide resources and allocate that energy to current reproduction, or to increase their prospects of reproducing at some point later on. So how do you how are you going to put your place your energy? You're going to do it to reproduce or to reproduce later on, right? So these things that we're talking about are related to the life cycle of an organism, or life history overall, which can define as the complete life cycle of an organism. But again, when we talk about life history, we are under the understanding that this life cycle has been shaped by much time and the environment's influence on your population. So we got to think in terms of trade-offs, a cost and a benefit for the organism. It's beneficial to leave offspring because you leave your genes to the next generation. The cost, though, like I said, could be vary depending on. So let's take an example of a Douglas fir and a cost trade-off of cost and benefit here. If a Douglas fir, which is a conifer, if a Douglas tree produces more cones, that costs energy, and that means the tree is not going to grow as much. Okay, so is it better to grow more now or reproduce more now? Right? And then for birds, the greater the clutch size, which is how many eggs they produce, that results in a greater death rate in the adults. Right? If you produce a lot of offspring, it costs you a lot more energy, and there's a lot more risk associated with it. That means there's a higher death rate, right? The alternative is produce lower amounts, and you survive to the following year, and you could reproduce more. So there's a trade-off there. This graph shows that trade-off for clutch size in birds, and here they looked at many different bird species, and they compared how many offspring they have each year and what their overall death rate is. So it turns out that some birds that don't produce a lot of eggs in a given year have a much higher survival rate, and that's indicated here because the graph is showing mortality rate. So the lower values here is lower death rate, over here is higher death rate. Your mortality is the opposite of survivorship. So if you have low value over here, mortality, that means you have a high survivalship rate, right? So it turns out that when we look at these mortality rates, you have a higher death rate over here for birds that produce a lot more offspring or a lot more eggs. So in other words, the trade-off there is if you produce more offspring, you have a higher chance of dying. If you produce less offspring, you have a lower chance of dying, right? So either way is a strategy to leave offspring in the long run. You're going to have a species that produces a lot of eggs in a given season, and many adults are going to die and probably their offspring, but some are going to survive and leave the next generation to continue the species. And then, or the alternative is live many, many years, and then you can reproduce every year and then leave offspring that way. So there's experimental data to support this here, and that overall cost of reproduction here. And they experimented here with a bird species that you see there in the picture there. And what they did was they looked at your, this is more of like observational perhaps, and sometimes they can do experimental here. But here, what they did was they experimented and removed eggs from the clutch. The clutch is how many they've laid in the nest. So the observers went and they removed eggs. They took an egg from one nest of a pair of this birds, the male and the female. They took the egg out, and then they went and they put it in another pair's nest. So what that did was that left this one pair of birds with one less egg, and that put extra egg in the other one here. So here they have their manipulations. They're going to have some right here that they didn't change, and they observed those birds. Then they're going to have some where they added eggs, 1 or 2 eggs, and the alternative was taking 1 or taking 2 away. Okay. Now what they did was then they followed those birds and looked at them the next year. They didn't manipulate their nest the next time. They just counted how many eggs these birds have. And they keep track of them because they put little bands on them and they know what the individuals are and so on. So they looked at those birds the following year, and it turns out that the birds in the prior year where they added eggs, the following year they had less eggs. That's this axis here is their clutch size the following year. And then those birds that they took eggs away, they ended up having more eggs the following year. And the explanation there would be, well, if you had more eggs, you're going to have to spend a lot more energy getting food to feed the offspring, and that drains you for the following year. You don't have as much energy. And when I'm talking about energy, I'm not talking about the way we talk about it. I'm talking about how much energy they have in them in the terms of fat reserves and all that to build more eggs for the females. And so there's that. There was the trade-off. This is observed by experiment, right? So here you see the consequences of putting too much effort over here. The following year, you're not able to produce as much offspring. And so we can see this trade-off here, and they look at another bird, kind of a sparrow type species here. And here they look at the clutch size, and there's variation, right? So not every pair of birds and the female is going to lay the same number of eggs. The clutch size varies here. And so for this species of bird, the clutch size, the bigger the clutch size is, the smaller the nestlings are when they went to go measure them a certain time after they hatched. And so what they found was that the larger the number of eggs that were laid, the smaller these are nestlings here, were going to be. And what's the explanation there? It costs energy and effort for the birds to be feeding these offspring. So with more mouths to feed, it's harder to give them enough energy, these offspring, to grow. And so that is another trade-off there. If you're a bird and you don't grow very fast, then there's a higher chance that you might die before you fledge and fly away from the nest. So you see that trade-off there. And then there's more experimental data here seen with lizards. This one's interesting here. They took a female. When the females, lizards or reptiles, are starting to make eggs, they have fat in their coelom, in their body cavity, and they're going to transfer that fat to make the eggs that are going to get fertilized, and then the eggs are going to be laid, and they have a yolk in them that nourishes the embryo during development. And it turns out what they did was they took some females, an experimental group, and they surgically removed some of the eggs that were starting to form, because there's only a certain number of eggs are going to go through development to mature for that season. And they went and they removed some eggs, and they only left some of the eggs left in the ovaries for those female lizards. And when the eggs were laid and the lizards were born, the offspring, this is what they look like right here. So this right here was the experimental group where they removed the eggs. The lizards right here, the offspring, when they were born, were larger than the control. they had some females that they didn't remove the eggs from, and so the average size of the little lizards that are born were smaller. And so there you saw that this is experimental evidence again for another trade-off here. If you have less eggs to develop, you have more energy to make bigger lizard babies, right? If you have less energy because you produce more eggs, then you have the normal size lizards, right? Now overall, if you're larger, your chances of survival when you're first born, when you're lizards, is higher. So it's always better to try to produce larger lizards, but there's a trade-off. Do you produce more that are smaller, or do you produce less that are bigger? There's a trade-off, because if you produce too few, then that may not allow your population to survive into the future. Now over here, just to see what was the causal nature of this, what they did was they did another experimental group with the lizards, and they didn't remove any eggs, but what they did was they went into each egg and removed some of the yolk, and then allowed the eggs to develop, the embryos to develop, and they ended up getting smaller offspring overall. So this was another experiment number 2, where instead of removing eggs, they removed the yolk, and that shows that that yolk energy source was needed for the growth of the embryos before they hatched. So again, you see another trade-off there. Now, reproductive effort in your lifetime as a species can be an additional trade-off. So there's a trade-off between age when you're reproducing and your fecundity, which is how many offspring you're going to have throughout your lifetime for the individuals in your population, right? So it turns out there's 2 general modes or strategies that Mother Nature has shaped in these populations, and this is true for plants and animals. There are some plants and animals that reproduce only once in their lifetime and they die after that. There's certain plants like agaves that do that. They'll flower once, they produce fruit and seed, and then the individual dies. Okay. Other plants, they produce seeds every year. Same for animals. When you only reproduce once in your lifetime, that's called similarity. That means you're only going to lay eggs once, or you're only going to make seeds once, or so on. And this is usually going to be seen in short-lived. So there's the connection between how long you live, your age at first reproduction, and so on. So if you're a short-lived species, that's your life history strategy that's been shaped by natural selection. You're short-lived, there's going to be a little chance of surviving to reproduce again. There should be a chance. That should be a C right there. So there's a little chance of surviving again. We see this in insects, some plants that grow in harsh environments, and in cases where a lot of effort has gone into reproducing, like the salmon, which is a kind of species that starts off in a river, then goes off to the ocean for many years, and they mature, and then swim back to their river where they were born, and it costs a lot of energy just to get back to where they were because they're having to swim back up river, and they use a lot of energy to do that, and the female uses a lot of energy to make all the eggs and stuff, and by the time they make it to the top and they spawn, the female lays the eggs and the male releases the sperm to fertilize them. They're out of energy. They die. It's just like, that's it. So that's similarity. Similarity, same thing. And then if you're like a human, there's heteroparity. You're going to live longer. You're going to reproduce several times during your lifespan. So that's the other strategy there, generally speaking. Now, the age at first reproduction also, this is, I think, also correlates with lifespan, right? So we talked about that earlier. If you're a long-lived species, there's going to be a delay in reproduction. Here, it takes a while for you to mature, but during that time, there's an advantage for that. You're not reproducing right away, but as a juvenile, before you become sexually mature, you're gaining experience, you're figuring out how to navigate your environment, acquire your resources, so that when it's time for you to reproduce, you're going to be better at surviving and trying to do that. For the short-lived species, there's a tendency for them to reproduce early, so the generation time is shorter. And here time is important, like an insect. This section looks at how the environment imposes limits on population growth. So no population can continue to grow forever. So here we're going to look at a model called exponential growth, which is what happens if you don't have any limits, and then discuss why populations cannot grow exponentially forever, and then define carrying capacity and explain what might cause it to change. So as I was kind of suggested that populations don't grow forever, so they often stay. I'm not going to say they always stay the same size like the notes say here, but they're for sure not going to continue to grow forever. If they did, then a mathematical model called exponential function, which would model exponential growth, would fit the situation. And this is a case where there are no limits imposed by the environment. That would be a case where there's unlimited resources available. And when that's the case, then we would have a rate of population increase, how fast it's increasing. The number of individuals increasing per unit of time could be described with R here in this equation here. Now, that growth rate actually depends on some positive changes and some negative changes. And so when we're talking about this growth rate, we're talking about how n is changing with time, right? So the number of individuals either being added or subtracted with time. And so we're adding when we're born. So, and B stands for birth. You're subtracting because individuals are being taken out of the population when they die. So this is a minus. That's why there's a minus sign there. And then you also have to consider migration. Immigration is coming in. So that would be positive. And then the reason this is negative is because emigration is leaving. And all of these are rates, number of individuals per unit of time. So D and E are actually minuses on change, and they would be a negative change. So the sum of all of these rates here together would give you R, which is the rate of population. And it says increase, but it is possible to have a rate of decrease as well in cases. But in the case of exponential growth, you're only increasing in the number of births out and immigration, if that's the case. If we ignore migration altogether, the number of births would be far outweighing the number of deaths, and you would get just this unlimited growth. So here's a model for exponential growth. It's often referred to as a J-shaped curve. You see that here in red. And here we're going to look at biotic potential. And biotic potential basically ignores, we're going to ignore immigration and immigration. So when those two are equal, immigration is negative and immigration is positive. So when those two are actually equal in magnitude, how much are leaving and how much are coming in, that cancels out. And all that's important then is births and deaths. When that's all over and done with, you end up with the value called R, which is the rate of increase. And in the case when you have unlimited resources, then your population is going to grow at its intrinsic rate. So Ri would be the intrinsic rate of natural increase. In other words, the intrinsic growth rate is just something that is characteristic of that population. Okay, so now this fancy thing right here, dn over dt, just means small changes in the population size over small changes in time. So basically this is just saying change in population over change in time. That's the slope. It's the slope of this graph right here. And you can see the slope is not, it's not linear, it's curvilinear. So the slope is not straight like this. That would be a linear slope here. So here would be n and this would be t. And this would be, the rise would be the change in n over the change in t. But in the case of populations, that slope is not a straight line, it changes. So here you start off with a very low slope, and then the slope increases and it continues to increase and increase. And so basically this population is exploding and getting bigger and bigger and at a faster and faster rate. That's exponential growth. Okay, so it's described by that equation there. Now, overall, that rate of change, that slope can be represented like this here. So where n is your population size and Ri is your intrinsic rate of growth. It's a constant. And here they give an example where Ri is equal to just arbitrarily, they put 1 there for that one. And even if R is 1, as your n value gets bigger, your population size gets bigger, then your slope is going to get bigger and bigger as the n gets bigger. As n gets bigger, the slope gets bigger. That's just the way it works. Okay, so that's exponential growth. Now, the idea of carrying capacity, no population can continue to grow forever, so the environment is going to impose a limit on your population, right? So if you do end up hitting that point where your environment can no longer support you, then there's going to be two things. Okay, one could be all populations are going to start off growing J-shaped. So you're going to start out like this. It is possible to just keep going and going and going, and then all of a sudden your population runs out of resources, and it runs out of resources fast, and then you would have, boom, a crash, right? That would happen if you way overshoot your population, your environment's ability to support you as a population. In other cases, the population increases and then begins to slow down in its increase and levels off. And when it levels off, you're going to hit a certain population size, because this is the end scale. And this is the temperature, this is the population size. That value right there where you hit a point where you no longer grow anymore, that's called carrying capacity. Okay, and sometimes they'll symbolize carrying capacity with the letter K. So you hit K, your carrying capacity. There's the K right there. Okay? So carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that the environment can support. So no population grows J-shaped forever. Okay. Sometimes, if your carrying capacity was here and the population grew too fast, it overshoots it, and it might not just come back to carrying capacity. It might have done so much, grown so much that boom, it just crashes. That could be a possibility. So now we look at what a model that better reflects the way most populations would grow if your population starts out small and is not at its carrying capacity. The equation kind of looks the same as your exponential equation, and it's kind of written here, but I like the way it's written here. There's your dn over dt, which is your slope, and it's still going to be equal to innate carrying capacity of arbitrary of 1, and n is your population size. The same thing here, except we add another factor. By adding this factor actually causes your growth rate to decrease as n gets bigger. And this should make sense. So in this example here, this is population size. This is the number of generations, which really is just as time goes by. And here they picked just as an example that your carrying capacity for that environment is 1,000 individuals. Okay, and so the equation has the Rn part here, just like we do over here. R is 1, R times n. But they have this extra term here. And this extra term here is saying take your carrying capacity and subtract the current population size at that time. And when you do that, then you divide by K. Okay, so let me redraw it because this looks horrible the way it's written there. This is Rn, which over here they're using 1 for R. It could be higher, it could be lower. And then they're going to take that and multiply it by this factor here. So this factor here is carrying capacity minus the population size at that given time divided by your carrying capacity. Okay. So here's the thing. If we go back over here to that example, K is 1,000. So they have 1,000 plugged in there and 1,000 plugged in there. And as your population size gets bigger, N. Okay, so as we start going up here, and that's happening as time progresses. As n gets bigger, you're going to have to plug that n in there and in right there. Okay, so let's say n is very small. Let's say you're at 1 or 2 individuals, just for a quick hypothetical. Now, let's just put it 1. If your population size is 1, you're going to put a 1 in there, and your population will grow, but you also have to consider this factor here, and you put a 1 in there. So 1,000 minus 1 is 999 divided by 1,000. That's almost 1. 999 divided by 1,000. So basically, you end up multiplying by practically 1, and you're still going to get the same. You're going to get that increase in growth still. So you're still growing J-shaped. But now as time is progressing further, okay, let's say you get to 500 individuals now. Eventually you got to that point. Now you would plug in 5 right here, 500 for n there, but you're also going to plug in 500 right there. So now it's 1,000 minus 500, which gives you 500 up here. And then down here is 1,000, so 500 over 1,000. Now you're going to multiply what used to be that rate times 0.5, which is going to half it. And now what's happening is, because the answer to this is your slope starts to slow down. Instead of being so steep anymore, it starts to slow down. In fact, it's slowing down the whole time as n gets bigger. Okay, and eventually, and if we continue with this thought experiment about what's happening with this equation, as n continues to get bigger and bigger, this top number up here is going to get smaller and smaller, because now we go from 500 to 600. You get to 900. Now it's 1,000 minus 900. You get 100 over 1,000. Now you're multiplying by 0.1. And so now your slope is getting real small. And eventually, you get to 1,000. So 1,000 goes right there. 1,000 goes right there. And let's take a look right here. 1,000 minus 1,000 gives you a 0 up here divided by 1,000. Now it's 0. So at 0, 0 times this gives you 0 slope. And that's when you level out right there. Okay, you've hit your carrying capacity. And so what you end up getting here is not an exponential growth. You don't grow J-shaped forever. That slope starts to change and slow down. It eventually goes to 0. That's a logistic function. So we call that logistic growth. And that gives you your S-shaped curve, or also sometimes you refer to it as sigmoidal, because sigmoid means S shape, like that. So that's the way actually the most populations are actually going to behave in real life. They're going to stay around that carrying capacity. Now let's look at a different way of representing that. Here is a graph not of n versus t, but instead they're graphing the slope from the prior graph, the slope, which is dt over dn over dt. And so really what they're graphing now is not the population size, but they're graphing the rate of change. They're graphing the slope instead. Okay. And they're graphing that now against your population size. Okay. So that's what this graph here is. So here is your population growth rate, and it's dt over dn. And they put a point in the line here. They drew a horizontal line, and that represents when your population size is at your carrying capacity. So in the prior example, this would be when your population gets to 1,000. Okay, in the example we're using, hypothetical example. So when you're at your carrying capacity, what is your slope? Your slope, your growth rate is 0. That's when you're at that line there, you're at your carrying capacity. The slope is 0. Whenever you're horizontal, your slope is 0, right? Now, in real populations, once a population hits their carrying capacity, and time progresses. So let's say we're right here and we hit our carrying capacity. In real life, the population never stays exactly the same. Sometimes it gets a little bit lower, sometimes it goes a little bit higher, and so on. But over time, it'll be hovering around some average value. Okay. Now I want you to take a look at what happened here. All along here, before we hit our carrying capacity, your slope is positive. Then you go 0. Then something happens and many individuals die, and now you're below carrying capacity. as they're dying, more are dying than being born. What's the slope? It's negative. dn over dt, the change in the population over time is now negative. There's a negative change in population. And then we change and we go back positive, so your slope now is positive again. And then 0 up here, and then negative, and then positive, and then negative. So my point here is that the population is always changing. Well, what happens when your population gets bigger than your carrying capacity? Right here's your carrying capacity, okay, where this graph of the slope hits your carrying capacity. You're at a growth rate of 0. dn over dt is 0. What happens if your population gets bigger than your carrying capacity? That's where it says above k. Well, what happens? You would be somewhere along the red line here, and somewhere along the red line here tells us we're at a negative growth rate. That means you're going down. Okay. What happens if your population right here, like you go below? Now you're below carrying capacity. What happens? Eventually your slope becomes positive. When you're below, let's say you're below your carrying capacity right here, you would be right here on that line, and that means you would have some sort of a positive growth rate there. That's how you interpret this graph here. Okay, so you're constantly going back and forth between positive and negative slopes, which is positive and negative growth rates. So this type of growth pattern of logistic growth has been seen in real situations. This one is in a laboratory over here, looking at some little arthropods called cladocerans. They're related to crustaceans overall. And here you have some fur seals on an island of St. Paul off of Alaska. And this scale is in the thousands, and it's of just the males, the breeding males of fur seals. And so we started in 1915 with low numbers, around 1,000 of them. And in real life, data is always messy, and we use math equations, nice math formulas, to give us a best fit line that basically models more or less what's going on there. And so what you see here is you start off initially as exponential growth, and then eventually the pattern levels off because those fur seals have hit their carrying capacity. So this is real data between 1915 and 1945. Then over here we have the cladocerans here, and they had two different populations. See, both of these roughly grow exponentially before they level off, but both of these overshoot their carrying capacity by some. For the population that's in yellow, their carrying capacity is somewhere around here. And in this one here, the carrying capacity for the purple line, or that population, is around there. But both of them then overshoot their carrying capacity, then come back and then start to hover around their carrying capacity. So both show logistic growth, not forever exponential growth. That's just not going to be possible.